Welcome, Wild Ones. I'm Josh Schlossberg, host of the Green Root podcast, the official podcast of Eco Integrity Alliance, eco-integrityalliance.org, where we're on a quest to uncover the roots of the ecological crisis. For this episode, we're speaking with Deanna Lynn Wulff of Unite the Parks. Deanna is the executive director of Unite the Parks, a nonprofit organization whose primary goal is to protect the federal land between Yosemite and Sequoia by creating the Range of Light National Monument. In addition to advocacy, a large part of her work is developing policy solutions to the problems that exist on public lands. Welcome to the Green Root Podcast, Deanna.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Well, the reason I invited you on is because there's a lot of overlap, of course, but right now, something that we've been looking at in Eco Integrity Alliance, and actually we have a sign-on letter that we're about to release about this, is the impact of forest roads, not just ecologically, of course, but in terms of there being a conduit for the ignition by human beings of wildfires. So obviously the Eco Integrity Alliance, everyone knows natural wildfires are not just okay, they are essential. That's all well and good. But right now it's about 84% of the wildfires across the West are actually set intentionally sometimes and sometimes accidentally by human beings. Our sign-on letter is addressing, well, if these are the ignition sources, maybe we should talk about more patrolling on these roads. And if that's not working, we might have to close some of these down. So that's the general topic, but I want to hear what you have to say on the issue and just why the issue of forest roads has caught your attention.
Well, it's a big deal. If you are trying to manage a landscape and you don't want to have a lot of human-caused fires, let's just assume people are just accidentally leaving their fires unattended, which is pretty common. You need to have a landscape that's manageable. And in some instances, just having like the Sierra National Forest, that's the area that I've paid a lot of attention to, has about 3,000 miles of roads when you add user-created trails and things like that. And that is a landscape that's nearly impossible to manage. So they don't really have people out patrolling for that's a problem right there. But even if you did, 3,000 miles of rugged dirt roads are almost impossible to maintain and also to control for wildfires. So for example, it took me to survey that landscape. It took me 2 seasons, meaning 6 months. So basically 2 years to really get an understanding of the landscape. And I do definitely have an understanding of it. And I mean, it's not something that a person can control or manage at all. So if you're looking to prevent human-caused fires, you can't do it on a landscape that has that many roads. So that's a number one issue, right? Prevention. Let's not have the fires in the first place, other than the controlled burns, which you mentioned, of course, are important, and fires are important. But I think everybody recognizes that fires at this moment are out of control, and they're out of what's expected. So
that's great summary of the issue. Yeah. So at Eco Integrity Alliance, obviously we're really concerned about, so there's wildfires, natural wildfires, some not natural, but then the agency response is always, well, I guess we got to log more forest. Oops. And we're saying like, well, where's some common ground here? Some common ground might be home hardening for sure. That's where the science shows that actually works. Or what about the people who keep starting these fires? So here in Colorado, where I'm living, I believe it was July of this year, there was a 4-day period in which, or maybe a 3-day period in which 4 fires started within 50 miles of one another, all of them human caused. Nobody talks about that though. They're just like, well, guess more cutting down of forest. I'm like, okay, well, let's take a look at what's going on here. Can anything be done? Our idea, part of it is like, well, maybe some of the funding that's used for logging can be actually paying people to do the patrolling. But what you're saying, I think, is the realistic situation. It's just there are so many well, national forest roads, there's over 380,000 of them. That's going to be pretty hard to patrol. Ergo, sorry, we might need to close some of these down. But let's
Yeah.
address, I don't know if it's an elephant in the room or whatever, the issue of access to forests, because even people who genuinely want to protect forests say,
Yeah.
well, I'm not so sure about keeping people out of the forest. So what would you say
Yeah.
about that?
Well, it has to be thoughtfully done, right? And what we propose, which we propose keeping all of these routes open to major recreational areas and obviously to people's private property, right? You want to keep all those routes open, and the only roads that we said, hey, this should probably be closed, are the ones that are maintenance roads, that are the roads that aren't used, and they're essentially built just to log a set of trees, right? So if you share that map, and I hope you will, you'd see that there's a spider network of roads that goes like across this entire ecosystem, and that's why you can't manage it really, you can't patrol it. But we don't want to prevent people from going out and having a good time and being able to go camping and do all the things that they want to do. I mean, that's what I spend my time out in this area doing. I'm camping, I'm doing dispersed camping. I like it just as much as everyone else. But I recognize that you don't need to have a road to every last living tree. That's not necessary, and it again, it's disruptive to the ecosystem, and it's not. I mean, nobody's recreating, on these roads that just kind of end, at a grove of trees. So yeah, it has to be very thoughtfully done, and that's the reason I took those 2 seasons to survey the landscape, so I could understand how it was being used and then propose a solution that um, includes recreation and a lot of options for recreation, but also where we do something where we take care of that ecosystem and start, replanting and allowing the forest to recover naturally, right? Because the other thing to think about when we're thinking about a road visually is it means there's no life on it, right? There's nothing there. It's a clear cut, right? So if you have a network of roads that's covering an entire ecosystem, you have a bunch of clear cuts all the way through it, that aren't good for, not good for wildlife, and not good for in terms of for erosion and the watershed either, right? So that's our proposal, is like, be reasonable and remove the routes that don't go anywhere and keep the ones that do, and be really thoughtful about that. But one more thing on that, what we proposed also was, okay, we're trying to make it easy for the management agency to manage the landscape, right? Because it's very hard to decommission roads. It's like it could take years just for one tiny. So we wanted to build that into the legislation, but we also put a caveat on there that said, that the agency can, make a decision to keep a road open. That if the public, for example, finds that it goes to a very important area. So we're just, again, trying to make them have as many options as possible so they can do the right thing, right? And if you don't do anything, then you leave the agency with a landscape they can't manage for wildfires, but they can't manage it for vandalism, for trash, I mean, there's a whole bunch of things that are going on the landscape beyond just, people starting fires. There's people growing marijuana out there, and they can't figure out where it is because it's obscured, right? So there's a whole bunch of things that are covered here. There's another area too that we can discuss. But before I launch into that, did you have any comments or questions?
Yeah, I think that's a perfect overview. Just a
Yeah,
few other items in regards to the roads, like you say, erosions.
yeah,
Uh, this road system, again, 380,000 miles, is a major impact on our watersheds, all the erosion, the soil erosion that comes in
yep,
and disturbs fisheries. We have the fact that it is the fragmentation of the forest landscape and
yep,
wildlife and all that. I mean, obviously people run things over when they're driving on roads. That's just a reality of the
right,
situation. Invasive weeds come in, which disrupts the ecology and is also tends to be more flammable. And the roads themselves can act as conduits of flame, kind of these wind tunnels, apparently.
right.
So there's all of that stuff. But one other piece of information that we have in our sign-on letter. So 94.9% of human-caused wildfires in the lower 48 occur within less than a half a mile of the nearest road. 60% occur within 1/8 mile from the nearest road. So that's pretty darn good data that you need a
Yeah.
road to start a human caused fire in the forest for the most part.
Right. That's right. And I mean, so I worked as a campground ranger. This is just kind of a a slight tangent, but very applicable. So I spent a season working in Sequoia National Park as a campground ranger. And what we would do is I always wanted to get out of the kiosk. Okay. I didn't want to sit in there and give the bear talk the 100th time. So I would do the patrols in the campground. It was Dorst Creek Campground. And I mean, every time we would go out, somebody would have left a fire. They just go off into the woods or go do their thing for the day, but they would have left, the campfire either still burning or smoking, and then we'd have to go over there and put the fire out, right? And that was an almost daily experience. So I think I don't think people are intending to do the wrong thing. I think it's just lack of experience. And so if you don't have people, like what I was doing is we would notice that there was still a fire burning, we'd go put it out, right? If you don't have that, then you have what you just described, where you can have 4 fires start on a highly windy, flammable, day, and then it creates a big problem for the firefighters, right, who are trying to fight 4 different fires at the same time in a different location. And again, people just aren't really aware, about high winds and the flammability of a forest. They don't have the experience, and so that's the reason that happens. And that doesn't excuse it, but it is a lack of experience usually that leads to that. So again, that's what the rangers are for, right? You're giving the same lecture 100 times 100 times a day, right? But that's your job. So I mean, you need more people out there like that doing it. So yeah, that's that in terms of the human caused aspect and having to have staff. Definitely want to have staff out there. And the good news is, you have people out working, you have people employed in jobs, right? And it's actually pretty fun being a ranger, though. Giving the same talk 100 times a day can be unfun after a while. So in any case, though, that the other thing that you brought up that I think is a really important thing to mention, is that the wind flow factor, right? So there's those 3 elements that you need for fire, and one is ignition, which we're talking about, human caused fires being the primary way fires are getting started. Then you have airflow and you have fuels, right? And most of the conversation these days is about fuels, as you already mentioned, because the argument is, well, we just need to log more, and then the forest won't burn as much. But that's a big overstatement, because the airflow factor is huge. It's 6 times more important and significant than fuels. And as it relates to roads, what the Forest Service is doing, at least in the Sierra National Forest, and I'm not sure about what's happening in every other forest, in other states, but their proposal is to cut 600-foot wide gaps in the forest ecosystem, with the center point of that starts in the middle of the road, right? So you've got 300 feet this way, 300 feet that way, which is creating this wind tunnel, right, across the ecosystem, which, according to the best available science, indicates that is going to increase the spread and the intensity of a fire, and also the size of a fire. So while the argument is made that, oh, we're making it safe, they're actually doing the opposite, and the science shows that it is the opposite. So unless you have a bunch of firefighters standing there, it's going to make the condition worse. So that's the other problem with the roads, is it's now those roads are being sort of an excuse to continue to make these big giant cuts in the ecosystem, which are of course damaging to wildlife. There's not much life left in places when they cut across like that, but also just more likely to make a fire worse. So again, if we cut them some slack, so to speak, like I think some people are intending to do the right thing with that, but the ultimate result is that it's more likely to make it worse. And so that's definitely tied to roads as well.
Yeah. And I would add, I think they're pretty much always thinking they're doing the right thing, right? I don't think they're like, ha 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 ha, how do we just they just have very limited one-sided information. And I think the onus that falls upon them is how they ignore any information that doesn't already meet the conclusions that they've decided.
That's right.
So you're saying that these are 600 feet wide.
Yes,
So that's two football fields, like length to length.
it's bigger than two football fields, but yeah, it's
Okay.
enormous. It's enormous. And I have been out in the forest ecosystem, and I sent you some pictures of that, just taking pictures of what it looks like. And it looks like, Armageddon. And it's very hard for me to understand how they could conclude that this is the right choice, right?
Mm,
So um I've had conversations with county supervisors and actually walked through the science to try to speak to your point, to say, listen, this is what the science is showing, like, breaking apart an entire paper, showing that when you get past I think it's 15-meter gaps, you end up increasing the depth, the spread rate, and the intensity of a fire, right? So okay, so 15 meters being about, I think, 48 feet or something, just for context, since we're talking about feet, right? So 48 feet versus 600 feet, like, obviously, that's the bigger the gap, the worse it's going to be, and that's essentially what the science is showing as well. In any case, we spent about an hour explaining this, and it wasn't me doing the talking. It was Dr. Joseph Wern. He's the chief scientist at Unite the Parks. He's a physicist. He really understands what he's talking about, and he got a grant from Cal Fire even to study this issue. So all legitimate. So, but at the end of the conversation, it just sort of, it was like he tuned out and just decided that he wasn't going to hear what we had to say. And it was a very frustrating experience because we had spent a lot of time preparing to help us move forward so we could do the right thing. But like we said, if they've already identified with a solution that is potentially wrong, but they're sort of wrapped into it, it's very hard to unwind that, right? You end up attacking their ego, even if that's not your intention at all, right? And so that's a problem that's a problem that humanity has, right? So we have to work on that. But yeah, ultimately, sometimes they just don't want to know, and you do have to work really hard to try not to make it something that's associated with identity. But there's only so much you can do on they have to be willing to sit down and hear what you have to say and not feel attacked by it, which
right.
is what happens, unfortunately.
Yeah, we've experienced that a lot. And unfortunately, they tend to respond with personal attacks a lot of time because they feel it as a personal attack.
Right.
And it's really hard to know what to do with that. I have found that no matter how politely and professionally you express an opposing viewpoint, most people are going to feel threatened by it, especially for something like this, where not just ecologically speaking, it's important, but human lives are at stake. So the idea that if they had been advocating something that's actually the opposite, so it's actually making things, as
Yeah.
we may see it, more dangerous to people because of the wind spread and other reasons why this is actually going to make fires more dangerous to communities and human beings. For them
Yeah.
to have to admit that, they'd have to admit, oh, I was wrong all this time. And we do have a thing in our society where it's like, everything online is like, in the debate, he owned that guy, right? So it's like, if you lose on a point, you lose the argument, you're a nothing. So there's really no
Yeah.
incentive for them to think better of it. And that's why we do grassroots advocacy. Basically, we find that if it becomes uncomfortable enough for them with enough people kind of crabbing at them, then they will just grudgingly change some of the policy. So the data is very important though. So this is crucial.
Yeah. And also, if you're able to have conversations with people one on one, that are less, they're not entertainment for people necessarily. They're not other eyeballs watching, where you can actually talk about it and then just sit with it and then return to it maybe a week later. I mean, this is you're building a relationship with someone so that you can learn together. And I mean, that's the idea. It's just
Mm.
the thing that sells eyeballs, that gets people paying attention is conflict on the internet. And generally, the loudest person is, who's the most angry gets the most attention. And that's not really great for building community or getting to the truth or figuring out a joint solution. And so it's been, I mean, lately for our work, it's been really frustrating because I spent, 11 years, and a lot of that time driving up to the mountains and going and having meetings and talking to people and building the relationships and all those things. And it's been lovely. But the moment you get, a few people online that amplify and are very angry, and then the truth doesn't matter so much to them, that all that work, unfortunately, it doesn't totally get destroyed, but it does take a hit. And I mean, it's not just the Unite the Parks problem. It's our social. We have a problem, across the country with this, right? Like, how are we going to build solutions together if anger is what spreads on the internet and not necessarily information, right?
That's right. Yeah,
So
no, I totally agree. Although I will admit that after years and years of providing scientific evidence to, say, certain decision makers, and their response is personal attacks, maybe once in a while I feed into some of the angry stuff just through my own personal frustration. But
yeah,
I try never to voice that publicly. I try to just work on that myself. But it can be very frustrating because not everyone is operating in good faith, I would argue, even if I
right.
don't think they're, evil Mr. Burns kind of style thing. So,
Well, you're right. I mean, that's something I learned just in the last 2 months, right? So we had our webinar, and the idea was to get as many people locally to understand the concept behind the Range of Light National Monument and kind of encourage dialogue, right? And then the wrong podcaster got a hold of this, not you. And suddenly, the bill that's out there, everyone can see the bill, right? It was downloaded, rewritten, like, and then reformatted to look like the bill and then posted. And it was like, it was such I mean, it was so inaccurate. And I mean, they had no problem doing that. And then on top of that, our own page got hacked, so we can't respond anymore. So I wouldn't describe that as playing fair, right? So I think there's plenty to discuss. There's plenty of real things to debate. But if you have to make up stuff, and then on top of that you're like, well, and we will just take the other person's voice out of the equation, I mean, that's obviously not in good faith. So I have a different view of maybe what I might do differently next time, to be, because you want to respect people and their opinions and give them the information, but maybe I would just try to have more local meetings. And I'm not sure if those meetings should have social media allowed, right? I'm not sure about that. I have to think about it, but I'm not sure that it's helpful um for our society.
hmm.
Yeah.
I think that's a really fair discussion to have. And yeah, we do need to figure that out and experiment with what works and what makes sense, and with all those things in mind. I do want to ask you more about the mission of Unite the Parks, but first, maybe let's put the road stuff to bed.
Yeah.
So just so people don't, and I guess they can use AI and falsely quote us or whatever,
Yeah.
but so we're not talking about shutting down the road to the popular trailhead and no one can use the forest. We're talking about these redundant, called superfluous, some logging roads. Some of them are illegally created user trails,
Yeah.
just some guy or gal out there hacking things for their motorbike. Right. That's the kind of stuff we're talking about.
Yeah, we're talking about these roads technically aren't even open. They're just maintenance routes that are just sitting there, and we're saying let's clean it up. So those aren't even there. And then the main routes stay. And I mean, a lot of the routes also in the Sierra National Forest in and of themselves are very interesting. Like the Ducey Ursham route is this really popular and an incredibly beautiful route, but it's also really difficult, and it's famous in the four-wheel drive community. And like, for example, that road in and of itself has value, right? And so we would definitely want to keep a road like that. It doesn't really, it definitely goes to places along the way, but it is actually a pretty interesting road. I can't believe people even get Jeeps down that road. It's incredible. I hiked it, and I'm just, if anybody can get down this road, they deserve, a medal at the end and a little trophy. So yeah, so we just want, so to sum up, yeah, we want to keep the recreational routes open. We want people to be out enjoying nature, but we don't need old maintenance roads that don't really go anywhere and are already closed. We're just saying, don't reopen them. It's pretty simple.
Fair. And then, of course, there are a lot more roads being punched in for all this quote fuel reduction logging. That's something we're trying to address as well. But yeah, so it's
Yeah.
the issue's getting worse. But maybe we can make a bit of a dent in it, and at least call attention to this stuff, the most
Right.
important stuff that we
Yeah.
all supposedly care about.
Right. We should
Yeah.
be talking about it, and people are afraid to talk about it, basically, because I think that they think they'll be accused of restricting access, and that's nothing to do with that at all. It's about making it a landscape that can be managed, both for people's enjoyment, but also to reduce emissions caused by humans. So simple.
Well, yeah. Well, Eco Integrity Alliance, and clearly your organization is not one to shy away from the controversial. We're here to be advocates. So
Yeah.
this is our role. But tell
Yeah.
us more about Unite the Parks, this Yosemite to Sequoia connection, all of that.
Yeah, it's been a really interesting experience. I'm going to just summarize like what we're trying to accomplish, and then I can give you a little bit about the journey of trying to accomplish it. Right. So you have Yosemite to the north, and then Sequoia-Kings Canyon to the south, and the missing piece is the Sierra National Forest. Right. But the upper portion is the longest interconnected wilderness in the lower 48. So that's where the John Muir Trail is. And that you can't get over the mountains except for like riding a horse or hiking in this area. So it's really already starting out to look pretty good, but there's a big missing piece that's in the center of it, and about half of that landscape is the area that has all the roads and has all the logging, and has a lot of destruction to the ecosystem right now. So what we want to do is, let's fix it. Let's plant trees. Let's create an integrated ecosystem, and let's create an interconnected trail system that people can ride their bikes on, and go hiking and enjoy nature. And that's what we want. And I mean, right now, recreation is just not a priority. No matter what people say, like 50% of the campgrounds in this forest are closed. Like, they're just not opened, and it's not a priority for the agency to even keep what it has operational. So that's the other thing, is you go up there, just related to the roads, and you'll see that a campground's closed, and so everybody is camped like at a trailhead, right, instead, because they have the closed sign. It's just, that doesn't make any sense, right? Where are these people going to use the restroom, right? So it's just we want all that to be fixed, and basically make this a recreational paradise, and a wonderful place for wildlife as well. So to recover. So that's the big idea. It's 1.4 million acres. So that's twice as big as Yosemite. And that's a big proposal, which means a lot of work, and more controversy, right? Because there's more people that will be affected by something of that size. But it makes sense to do it. And that's what Muir did. When he had Yosemite and Sequoia protected, that's about the same size acreage, right? So we're just trying to finish the job, basically. Like, let's finish this and let's do it right. But to have something like that happen, well, it's kind of an intense process. I can't really recommend it. I would just, recommend a different path for most humans. So bake cookies or something, or I don't know. I'm not selling it, right? But It's just that it's you have a lot of conflict then, and you're going to have to learn how to manage the conflict that regularly comes to visit, basically.
Yeah, it's quite an undertaking, but extremely important. And yeah, some of us are, you could say, brave, you can say foolish enough to take on these difficult things that we know are going to get us a lot of heat, but
Yeah.
sounds super important what you're doing.
Well, initially, I should explain that like I was just thinking I knew the northern aspects of the forest really well. And then I had a lot of conversations with George Whitmore, which he's one of the first climbers to climb El Capitan. Like he's an old climbing guy, right? And he's like, well, what about the rest? And I said, that's true. The rest is important as well. And I thought about it, and through our conversations, I said, yeah, it makes more sense to just try to get the whole thing. I mean, it isn't just the conversations, but then hiking in areas that were unprotected, and it was like we're picking beer cans out of lakes, and I was thinking, like one particular lake, it was actually when he first drew his map, it was actually I think 30% larger than Yosemite is today. So like Yosemite was created via legislation, right? And then right after that, Congress started pulling out sections of it to allow for logging and mining and all those things, right? So I was hiking at one of the lakes that was taken out, and you could see a line in the distance, and me and my friend were just, there's all these beer cans that have been thrown in this really beautiful lake, and of course I was irritated. But we were taking the cans out, and I was thinking, like, if this was protected, I would probably not be doing this. And so that sort of sealed the deal. And I said, I'm just going to try to get the whole thing, because I don't want somebody in the future to be pulling beer cans out of a lake, that has a mine above it, So, and this was a really beautiful area. I mean, just phenomenal, like world-class scenery, and you don't need to see that. So, yeah, there's many stories along the way in terms of doing the protections, but you do when you're dealing with the conflict part. So that's the idea part, right? Then there's the work, all the surveying, but then the conflict, right? And you have to develop the skills to handle that and to not take it personally when people are mean, because they're going to be mean, right? And then also be able to hold your position, because a lot of people are going to be trying to push you in a different direction, right? So there's just a lot. I think we should all be in yoga, right? So to sort of learn to calm down, not react, and then make a decision that's reasonable and thoughtful. I think that's what is needed to stay in a game like this for a long time. I've had to learn, because let me tell you, it was not like that in the beginning, So I've had you get 10 years of practice, and eventually you figure out, don't send that email, basically. But we've all figured that out, right? I mean, with emails at least.
No, I could say not all of us have figured that out, is what I can attest to. But yes, it's an important lesson.
Yeah, it's just, and then also to find the people with whom you're aligned with, and who are supportive and who you can support. And I mean, that makes for a much better day and also experience, right? So, I mean, that's part of your job, is that yes, you're going to be fighting the battle, but you want to make sure that you have a good team of people. And like this podcast is a perfect example. Like we can have this conversation about roads, and hopefully it'll be helpful to many people. And then we're sort of, building our network and hopefully keeping it positive as best as possible.
I agree. I
Yeah.
try every day to stay as positive as possible.
Right.
Well, thank you so much, of course, for all of your work, but for coming on the podcast. Where can people find more information about Unite the Parks if they want to get involved?
Yeah, it's pretty easy. You can go to the website, unitetheparks.org. If you want to learn about the National Monument, there's a little section on there that has a ton of information. We've put up a lot of fact sheets because there's been so much misinformation that I'm like, well, we'll at least put the truth out there, and the people who are interested can go and find it, right? But yeah, unitetheparks.org, really easy to find online. And if you want to reach out to me and have a conversation, I'm also available at director@unitetheparks.org. So pretty easy. And I do respond to emails as long as they are reasonable and aren't filled with threats. So.
Fair. Well, thanks again, Deanna. I really appreciate you coming on the Green Root podcast and everything you're doing.
All right. Well, thank you, Josh. I really appreciate the opportunity. It's been great.